Hello everyone. Hopefully you can see me all right and hear me okay. Welcome to the session. My name's Ben. I'm from a company called Rare Consulting. So hopefully this is what you're expecting today. So welcome to anyone who's new to these, and welcome back to anyone who's been before. So I'm from Rare Consulting. We're a product and research business. And in today's session, I'm going to be taking you through some of the research that we've been gathering into the COVID-19 pandemic in the consumer markets and looking at how behavior has evolved over the last 8 weeks that we've been tracking it. And in this session in particular, we're going to be looking at some aspects where we're looking at how people might change in the future. What types of attitudes have people developed, and what types of intentions are we seeing that might carry through to when this might end, whenever that is. So it'll be 45 minutes. There's plenty of areas we're going to be looking at. If you're new to GoToWebinar, you have your control panel there. You can ask me a question at any time. Please feel free to put questions in as we go. There will be a Q&A at the end, but I'm more than happy for you to be pinging questions in as we go through. So thank you very much for attending. In terms of what we're going to cover today, so I'll give you a bit of context to the project, so a little bit of what we're doing, what we're up to. Then we're going to be talking through some of the key themes. As I mentioned at the top, in this session, what's been quite interesting is to look at people's future intention, how they feel when, if they could imagine a scenario where things are relaxed a little bit, how they feel they might respond. And of course, there's loads of different things that we're seeing in the data there. I'm also then going to do a dive into brand reputation data. So each week we are measuring how different brands are perceived in the market and how their response has been understood by people. And then finally, we're going to look at different categories as we go through. So we're going to be looking at grocery, alcohol, retail, beauty, DIY, exercise, entertainment, and a bit of travel as well. So plenty of things to get into in this particular session. So what have we been doing? So the last three, that's a weird way of asking that. What have you been doing? Last 3 weeks, we've been tracking changes in, last 8 weeks, sorry, tracking changes in consumer behavior and how people have responded to the pandemic. So we've been able to see what behaviors have changed week on week. We've got a brand perception tracker as well, where we're measuring up to 100 different companies and seeing how they respond across different categories. And we also have our qualitative analysis. So each week we give different households a task to undertake. And then we look at how are they responding in entertainment, how are they responding in retail, how are they responding in different categories, to really get a sense of what's going on underneath the numbers. So obviously with tracker data, it's super useful to get a big picture, but what it doesn't necessarily tell you is what's causing the types of trends that we're seeing, and that's the whole purpose of that type of research. So there's plenty to get your teeth into. And in terms of the sorts of questions, so these are the sort of things that people are looking for in these sessions. So this is from a recent bunch of people who attended a webinar last week. We asked them, what is it that you're looking for? And I think this is quite interesting for anyone in business to see actually where's everyone else's head at, what are the sort of questions that are coming up. And what you can see there is that people companies are looking for a bit of a sense of what they might expect into the future. They're also trying to understand more kind of common and universal themes that exist that will have an impact on their category as well as their category in particular. So as you can see from the sort of questions, we get tons. I mean, all sorts of different questions and different ways that people want to assess the data. So this is really useful for us to obviously base our weekly webinars on. Just a note on that, actually, we are running these each week. So if you find any value from these sessions, then they are free to attend every week, and you're more than welcome to join. The sort of headline, really, I think, for this week is we can really, really start to see it in the data. There is certainly a sense that there is a change coming. When you look at, so if you look at it in terms of the government is responding, how businesses are responding, there's a bit of a change in the narrative and a bit of a change in the wind in some respects. So there's talk about the furlough scheme being wound down from July. We've got an announcement on Sunday where the rumours are that the lockdown will be relaxed in some way. Quite what that looks like, of course, none of us really know, but that will have a huge impact on how people will now start to engage and interact with people. Obviously, then will have a knock-on effect for different organisations as well. In terms of support levied at organisations, mentioned earlier about the furlough scheme, we're seeing with the coronavirus interruption business loans that there's still some blockage getting those loans out to larger organisations, but it's been interesting to see the uptake in the smaller government 100% government-backed loans, the bounce-back loans, where in the first 48 hours of them being live, around £2 billion worth of loans were taken out. So clearly that support is there and people are using it in order to sort of help plan and help themselves when they get back on their feet, whenever that might be. What we've seen in some of the research we've done when we've asked businesses how they're responding, how they're preparing and what they're doing, it's quite curious to see that, it's also quite heartening to see how many businesses in the UK are being quite innovative. So when we polled around 150 different companies last week, 33% of them said that they believed their business to be responding in quite an innovative fashion to the pandemic. So there's clearly an appetite for us here to look at doing things slightly differently, which is certainly encouraging. So there's definitely a sense that change is coming, and with that is looking at the shifts in mindsets for consumers. And I thought to begin with, we would set out a poll for you to answer. So if we can set that poll live, what do you think consumers are looking forward to the most? Is it family, meeting others, work, hugs, or the pub? Just let that run for another 10 seconds or so, just while we collect the rest of the responses. So what are consumers looking forward to the most? Is it family, meeting others, hugs, work, or the pub? Answers on a postcard. Great, and if we can share those results, be interesting to see what people put down. Yeah, interesting. So 39% of you said family, 44% said meeting others, 5% said work. Yeah, I imagine that's probably a lot of parents who are just quite looking forward to getting back to the office and getting childcare back in, right? 7% said hugs and 5% said pub. Interesting. It sort of reflects actually, I think, where we kind of collectively are. That's really interesting. Thanks for doing that. When we asked people, consumers, we asked them, what is it that you're looking forward to the most in an open box? So this went out to, I think it's 876 people. It's really curious to see what mentions come up, what words come up, and it's quite kind of overwhelming, to be honest. It's mostly all to do with family, being able to see people, meeting people, visiting people. It has a real kind of rich connection to what people actually want to do. You look further down the list, you've got 5% saying they want to go to the pub. And there's always going to be some people, but that's obviously a space that is, historically has been where we form connections. We come up with our greatest ideas. We've had some of our most, formative romantic experiences in some cases. It is sort of the backbone of a lot of society in this country. And then we've got 4% saying travel. Now, travel's a really interesting one, and certainly in terms of our involvement in in supporting different businesses, it's been quite curious. In the last, I would say, 5 working days, we've had just a flood of inquiries from travel companies, and I think that maybe there's something out there, maybe in the water or in the air or whatever. No bad jokes, but there's clearly something out there. I think it's encouraging people to think about it. And again, travel is indicative of time spent together, going places, having experiences. Then we've got hugs and the ability to just meet and see people, and work at 4%. So I think for a lot of people, just the routine of being able to go to work and live your life as close as it was before is really quite powerful to people. What you can't see at the other end of the spectrum is retail is about 3%. So we're seeing that people are much more at the moment to be geared around spending time with others, spending time with their family, engaging kind of richer connections with each other, as opposed to, you know, necessarily going out and spending this, you know, the money they might have been able to accumulate over this period. But of course, everyone has had a very different experience of this pandemic. And what's quite nice, I think, is also to read some of the quotes and see some of the things that people say when we look at this. So, you know, this one here, just looking forward to giving my dad a hug, to know that my friends and family have survived, just seeing family and friends and socializing, going down the pub, being able to travel around and move more freely. You know, it's quite kind of rich in terms of what people are looking forward to. So to get a sense of the mindset, that's certainly, you know, where people are. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. It does yield quite an interesting paradox, because what we're seeing is there is a bunch of people who are really looking forward to seeing other people and spending their time with others, and there's a sizable cohort, certainly not the majority, but a good size of people who are actually saying, I'm quite enjoying this, and I'm quite enjoying the fact that I don't want to go back to work, and I don't want to go back to how things the way they were. So, you know, that can't be it can't be underestimated how important that is. As you might have seen in the sort of questions we get asked before these sessions, lots of people are asking for data on key workers. So I thought I'd just give a brief slide on that. And mostly to say that really what we're seeing in terms of what people are looking forward to next, the pattern is quite universal. Certainly it is quite uniform. We're not seeing necessarily that key workers desiring for different things compared to other people. Actually, collectively, everyone is kind of in the same place. And what we've known from last week, we did quite a dive on our last webinar into key workers in particular. What we do know about them is that they are more likely to be happy, they're more likely to be socializing, they're less likely to be anxious, they're more likely to be using chat services and video services to speak to people, they're much more engaged in kind of social activities. And when it comes to consumer categories as well, they're more likely to be engaged in aspects that are considered productive, like, for example, home maintenance, gardening, and so on. So in terms of, although they might differ in terms of how they engage in categories and how they might interact with other people, and they might be a little bit more sociable, when it comes to what they're looking forward to is the same as everybody else. It's about connection, family, and being able to have, you know, quite human experiences. Where we do see some quite stark differences when you look at genders and how they compare, and this is obviously a reasonably sort of crude way of looking at it, but demographically speaking, across age and across other variables such as where people live, you see a fairly common pattern. Comparing men and women, we're seeing, although the pattern is quite similar, so they're valuing seeing family more than anything else, there is quite a stark difference between the genders there as well. So that's just, I think, quite an interesting observation in the data. Again, why is this important? This is going to be important for anyone, you know, looking at comms, anyone developing products and services, and particularly if we've got 33% of the UK considering developing new innovations to create new revenue throughout this period, then we really need to understand consumers and their motivations much more. And what really comes out here is that our ability to connect with each other is far more important than anything else. And that's important to bear in mind when you're in a role where you've got to come up with some pretty quick short-term solutions to things. So we've also looked this week at, we've asked people, you know, imagine a world, right? Imagine a world where the lockdown's been lifted and it's safe to return to some degree of normality. Now, it's sort of problematic in some respects because obviously we don't know what that looks like, and it does require a little bit of imagination on behalf of a respondent. In isolation, it's a little bit meaningless, but when you look at it over time, it becomes more interesting because you start to see the patterns, and it's the difference in the deltas and the points that really start to paint the picture. So if we look over the last 2 weeks, one of the categories where we're seeing more movement than other categories is actually in travel. So you ask people whether they feel they're going to be doing more, less, or about the same compared, to normal. What we're starting to see is there a slight shift in perspective where people are, there's a delta difference there of 3% compared to last week, of people saying they feel like they'd be more likely to spend in that particular category. Compare that with entertainment. Entertainment has a similar sort of pattern. Entertainment's a category that we've seen over the last few weeks has been really fascinating to look at in terms of where people spend their time, where they're investing their energy during this period, and lots of people spending it learning new skills or or really delving into quite sort of particular hobbies and interests they have. Entertainment is of course at the heart of entertainment is about self-expression, collective groups where a lot of people feel their sense of identity with music, film, etc. And that's a sector again where we see some positive trend for that particular sector in terms of people's future intentions to engage. So we're seeing over the last couple of weeks people claim they're likely to spend more post-lockdown. Retail, however, is a slightly different story. This is a sector that we know has struggled with considerably, and we don't necessarily see the same pattern that we've seen in travel and entertainment with a slight increase in willingness to engage with it. In fact, it remains relatively muted. Beauty as well, we're seeing that there's a growth in the number of people saying they don't see any particular change. And I would imagine that when we know more about this announcement at the weekend into next week, beauty is going to be one that shifts quite quickly. And there's obvious reasons for that as people engage a little bit more. There's probably more reasons to try and do your hair and makeup and whatever. I mean, I've sort of let this go a little bit in the last few weeks. So that's quite an interesting pattern. We work a little bit in beauty with a manufacturer of toxins and dermal fillers. What they've seen in other categories, in other countries, I should say, sorry, is that as soon as lockdown measures have been relaxed, people are going straight away to their beautician and having treatment. So I think that sector is going to move quite quick. If I was a betting person, I'd certainly look at that. DIY and home management is really is an interesting one because this has been a real growth sector in the last eight weeks. We've seen it's just been growing and growing and growing in terms of people's engagement and spend in this particular sector. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that with so many people furloughed, so many people's patterns and habits have been, changed overnight. Lots of people are looking for productive things to be doing in their time. So hopefully out of this, we'll come out with lots of people who actually feel quite confident with home management and DIY. And that's a sector where it remains quite steady in terms of people's future intention. When we look at alcohol, again, we're not seeing much change there, but I think there are some elements of concern in this particular sector. I'll dive into alcohol in a bit more detail later on. But there's certainly a case where people who were drinking alcohol quite frequently prior to the lockdown are showing a sign that there's a high proportion of people who will continue to drink every day as a coping mechanism. So there are some concerns with that device for a lot of people. Exercise as a sort of final category I'll wrap up in terms of people's future intention is the net effect with this is that we're seeing a slight boost with this. It's again fascinating category because what we've seen over time is that people who were not quite gym bunnies, people who were maybe sort of engaged with it occasionally, have resorted more to walking and probably lower in exercise that has a lower intensity to it over the last 8 weeks. So there's a category that's seen some quite interesting shades to it in terms of how people are behaving. But certainly at the moment, there is an indication that we will start to see a slight boost. So in terms of the categories, then I think there's travel, entertainment. As we see things now, there's certainly some sort of movement there, and I think that has a lot to do with rumours around changes to the restrictions here in the UK and what we're seeing in other countries. obviously we're exposed to global media, so we're aware of what's happening in other countries, and that will certainly have an impact on people. How we're feeling though is interesting. So over the last 6 weeks or so, we've been looking at how the UK is feeling, and overall, it's been a pervading sense of anxiety across the country. And this week is the lowest level of anxiety we've seen. What's interesting with the data in particular this week is actually movements we've seen in other emotions. So we're more likely to see that we've seen the highest level of restlessness this week. So people are feeling restless, but ironically, content is at 15%. So there's a question that's just come in about if there's any insight into who is enjoying lockdown and not wanting it to end. We can obviously we can obviously delve down and pull that data out quite easily. And just to back up the notion that some people are quite enjoying it, is that around 15% of people right now feel content and actually quite enjoying it. So I think it'd be remiss of us to say everyone's going to sort of respond in the same way. I think we're going to have very different responses to the end of lockdown. And this data helps to back that up. And in particular, our sense of community, we've been looking at how people's sense of community changes each week in terms of their family, their friends, and globally. A couple of really interesting points of this. I'll just draw your attention to the line at the top, the blue line. You can see quite an uptick there, and that's the line that reflects people's sense of community with their family. As there are rumours going around, I think people are starting now to imagine that the ability to see their family is not too far away. And so that sense of community is increased towards their family this week. Compare that though with our sense of community with others around the world, which is your brown line down the bottom. And that's shown in the past couple of weeks a downward shift. And I think it's been really quite interesting because over the past 2 weeks, we've seen more cases of countries loosening their lockdown measures, more people being allowed out and able to engage with each other. That might have something to do with, that might partly explain why we're seeing our sense of community this week is at 47% and is the lowest we've seen for 5 weeks. When we went into lockdown and people were sharing stories from other countries, we could see quite a bit of a shift. And this is really important stuff because and I talk about this every week. I don't talk about it in too much detail, but if you think about where the UK has been in the last 3 years, this sense of community and where we feel our allegiances are has obviously been disrupted over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in the world of politics. That has had an impact in terms of where we spend, who we identify with. Unfortunately, we have seen quite a kind of divide. And so this is going to be a really important trend to monitor for anyone who is particularly communicating with for companies that are more international and are more focused on trying to convey regionality in your comms. And we've seen certainly as we go into the next section, we've certainly seen a geopolitical dimension to brand perception over this period, and that's been exacerbated by 5G conspiracy theories. Unfortunately, some of the red tops being pretty insensitive to other countries as well has led to some negative perceptions of some companies from overseas. So just stuff to be aware of, and the reputation management is a really important aspect. So in terms of the key themes for this week, it's all about family. We can see changes to people's emotions, or not everyone is quite willing at the moment to just rush out the door as soon as they can and go spend. Everyone's going to have a very different response to this, and it's very important to understand those segments in more detail. So how are the brands doing? We've been looking at different groups, so retail, banking, telco, and supermarkets as 4 examples. We're capturing other ones as well, but these are the ones that we're taking to public each week. And you can see supermarkets generally have been performing better than most categories, although there are some variations week on week. We're seeing overall a bit of a downward trajectory for a lot of different categories, and I think businesses have really struggled to respond to this in an effective manner. And it's a complicated issue. I think you can kind of understand that. Looking at banking, so this week I'll just do a quick dive into banking. We change it every week, so just for reference, this is this week's data in terms of how people feel different banks have responded. So we asked them, to what extent do you feel they've given a good or bad response to the pandemic? And you can see there at the top, you've got Halifax, you've got Santander, Lloyds, all performing better than companies like First Direct. What's interesting in this is it's quite interesting looking at some of the challenger brands. So Monzo has been a bit of a darling of the fintech scene for the past 18 months, and Starling Bank. I use both. I think they're pretty good services. But right now in a pandemic, I think what they're struggling with, and this comes out quite a lot in when you look at sort of detailed analysis from the banking sector, is there are some concerns with these challenger banks because of the way their funding model works, and because they're not necessarily so well established. There could potentially be some issues with new customer acquisition, and you can see in terms of new customer growth for Monzo, really high last year, has showed signs of actually slowing down a little bit. It makes sense. People aren't going out spending as much. Okay, that's certainly one dimension. I think there is also a dimension where, as we've seen over the past 8 weeks, to try and summarize as best as I possibly can, we've seen a real kind of move to more sort of traditional notions, spending time with family, people investing in their homes, really kind of bunkering down a lot. And some traditional values we've seen really kind of spring up in that process. And with that, I think some institutions which are founded on very kind of old traditions, the way they do things, I think will potentially respond in different ways to what we might have expected before. And I think banking is potentially one where we'll see that people have got a heightened anxiety over their finances. It's going to get worse in the coming months because inevitably there will be redundancies in companies. Furlough scheme is effectively sort of kicking a problem down the road if you can kind of look at patterns. And what we've seen with Monzo is week on week, the perception that they've given a good response has been relatively muted. But I think with this, there's been, as an organisation, there is a kind of operational barrier to that because of the way that it works and the way that it's funded. What we do see, though, is quite concerning for lots of brands, is there is a direct correlation between your response and the level of trust, and that's vitally important for any business, because ultimately trust is the cornerstone of loyalty. And we've seen this in other research that we've done for other companies, that when you ask people why they would shop from one brand over another, it's usually quite emotive. It's usually that there's some relationship and positive attitude there, and it's often to do with the fact that they trust something. So these are really important dimensions to consider. So when we look at retail this week, M&S is one we've seen kind of bobbing up and down week on week. It's come out top this week. Home Bargains is a brand that, no, it's not necessarily known for being the sort of sexiest brand out there, if I could say that. I'm going to say it. But they've done really well in the terms of their response. So 46% of people feel that, would agree that their response has been good to the pandemic. And when you look at some of the news stories about how they've responded operationally, there's some really great examples of the care they've given in store. So, hats off to them. I think they've done a really good job. Compare that to the other end of the spectrum, where you've got companies that are, have not exactly without controversy, these businesses run by Mike Ashley and Philip Green, and it's no real surprise really. So they're certainly down the bottom end of the scale there. Looking at how Fraser as a particular organisation, as a business, they've obviously focused on cost saving and some element of sort of retrenching a little bit to preserve the cash position. When you look at the level of response has diminished week on week, as has the level of trust, as has the level of likability. So what does this mean for them longer term? I think there's going to be some question marks over their response, and you might find ultimately that it actually becomes harder for these types of companies to respond positively, because what we're going through is a highly emotional thing, and we're not going to forget the companies that have taken care of others compared to those that haven't. And I'll show you in a couple of slides' time why that's important. So clearly some question marks in terms of how they've responded. Sainsbury's is an interesting one. Again, was heralded as being a bit of a darling of the supermarket category a couple of weeks ago. What we have seen in more recent weeks is, since the announcement that they believe the measures of social distancing are going to be enforced until later in the year, people have been, the perception of them has struggled a little bit, even if likability is doing reasonably quite well a week ago, and they've put in place lots of initiatives, kind of tactical initiatives to support. But I think that the news about the amount they're having to invest, the loss of the depletion on the stock market and their valuation, and the social distancing measures are going to have an impact. And if you're someone that shops on a day-to-day basis in an environment like this, it's going to have an impact on your experience. So it causes quite an operational challenge for lots of different companies. And the reason why these things are important is, again, when you ask people what are their, what drives them to choose one company over another. It's quite curious. I mean, over years, you'd normally see it's normally to do with price, normally to do with, value for money, quality of product. It's reasonably predictable, to be perfectly honest, when you look at driver analysis. But the interesting movements are down the bottom of the slides, and you can see that I've highlighted their sustainability and this idea that an organization respects people's health. And what we're seeing is that week on week, this idea that, what matters to people is that a company does respect the health and safety of its employees, is something that 2 and 3 people agree is important to them. And that's going to continue, throughout this these measures that we have put in place. And it's something I think a lot of companies who haven't necessarily put those measures in place, I think will ultimately suffer as a result. So when we're thinking about, activating, going back live, trying to communicate again, businesses really think about the comms, and we really need to think about actually what drives choice in your particular category. We are seeing that it is changing quite a bit. We're not going to see a static picture in this either. We are seeing movements in some of these aspects. So very important to be aware of. As is this idea, if you look down the right there, to this idea that comes from an international company, that we're seeing actually this idea that things are locally sourced and made in Great Britain generally performs a little bit higher, but certainly not as high as, is a company that is sustainable and actually cares for its employees. So there's certainly an environmental component to this. So now I'm going to go through the different sectors and highlight some movements in the key consumer categories that we're tracking each week. So it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I will dive down into certain aspects that are interesting. I think with travel overall, we're seeing that the intention at the moment is relatively stable. However, we are seeing a shift in perspective, and there's 2 data points that are really telling me this. And that's, firstly, we're seeing that 3% shift in people saying they're likely to spend more in travel this week compared to last. And purely by activity we're seeing in the market, by inbound inquiries that we're getting. So I know that certainly there seems to be a movement in that particular sector. If we think about entertainment, this is one that has been fascinating. I found fascinating in the last few weeks, and we've done a qualitative diary study on this. If you go to our website and hunt about, you will be able to find the last diary study, which is a qualitative view on what people are doing in entertainment. So we've got that on the website if you'd like to have a little look and a bit of a digest. Entertainment's fascinating for lots of reasons. Initially, a lot of people were talking about it's all about streaming, everyone's subscribing to Amazon, Netflix. It's not the case necessarily. What you're seeing for people who are in streaming is they are moving between streaming services to get better deals. So they're more likely to be looking at family or kind of sharing access to help save costs. People are investing their time and effort each day in learning new skills. So we're seeing around, I think last week it was 10%, this week is 8% of people saying they are learning a new creative skill every day, which is huge when you think about it. 1 in 10 people learning something new every day. But in terms of music and streaming, yes, people are doing that on a regular basis. But again, it's the kind of interesting stuff is further down the kind of list, really, I think. In terms of people's daily habits and routines, it's interesting to see the changes in terms of content that people are interested in. Last week you might have noticed, last week was predominantly a colder weather, and I wonder whether that's had an impact on people's choice in content as well, spending more time indoors. There's familiarity with it, with kind of keeping warm and contained at home prior to the weekend sunshine. So I think that might have had something to do with the results we've seen. Podcasting hasn't necessarily sort of taken off. I think obviously it's a format that generally you tend to see people do more when they're on their commute. But learning a new skill, we've seen really quite grow throughout the last 8 weeks. It's remained quite steady now, and certainly when we look at retail, that is one aspect where people are investing quite a bit in retail. In grocery at the moment, it's more about frequency. So we're seeing that what we're seeing overall is that there's a little bit more evidence of a sort of top-me-up behaviour. So people are more inclined at the moment to go to express supermarkets compared to last week, and just for sort of more frequent top-me-ups. As a category, there's a high proportion of people who are buying essentials online. So last week it was 17% of people saying they were buying their essentials online. This week it's 14%, but it's still really high. Lots of people have got over this barrier of online shopping. They've put in their details and they've given it a go for the first time. And I think the grocery sector is really going to feel the benefit of that longer term. So there's huge potential for anyone who works in this category. Something I thought was great, and I as a research and product innovation company, I'm always fascinated by what people are doing with new initiatives. OpenTable as a business, you'll remember them for booking a reservation at a restaurant. They've flipped their business model, which is a genius idea. When I read this, I thought, oh, for God's sake, of course, this makes sense. Why wouldn't you do that? Supermarkets are going to have to put in place social distancing. What OpenTable have now done is created a reservation ticket so that you can reserve your spot to go into supermarkets. So it'd be interesting to see whether supermarkets start to adopt this technology and start to use it. It's genius. It took them a week to implement. Again, what we're seeing with in the world of innovation is that there's loads of amazing examples of companies coming up with really cool initiatives that haven't costed the earth. They've just reimagined things really quickly. They've thought of a problem and thought of a way to solve it. And this is a really good example. So I just want to share that with you, because when I saw that yesterday, I thought, oh man, it's genius. Of course, simplest ideas are always the better, though, aren't they? So that's what we're seeing in shopping. More evidence of top-me-up behaviour. Lots of people still shopping online. We are certainly going to see patterns of behaviour will move out of this lockdown as people have become more familiar with that process. When we've seen with home and DIY, as I mentioned up top, there's been a high degree of engagement with this category throughout the pandemic, in particular the last 6 weeks. We are seeing that people are engaged in this. 53% of people who were previously engaged in DIY and home management are doing it at least once a week. 79% of people are cleaning every day at home, so homes probably never look cleaner. It's a good job you can't see my house, because that is not the case. And we might see that, despite the fact there's not a new season of Bake Off, even though you can see the Stand Up to Cancer Bake Off, it's not the same though. We've got 21% of millennials saying that they baked at least once a week. So people, kind of reverting back. I mentioned earlier about this kind of notion of going back to some more traditional activities. People also reverting back to more kind of, more sort of tasks and activities that require a bit more of a sort of personal involvement in them, should we say. It's great when you pull the cake out and go, look at this, it's great, it's wonderful. It's about, something that's quite expressive. And we're seeing that in people's relationship with home and DIY, in particular with gardening, has seen a huge growth over the last few weeks. So we might find that we're going to have a nation of people who have learnt new creative skills and have become much better at improving their home environments. really good example of an organization, again, I came across this week, who were struggling financially with sales. So this is a bakery called Mr. Holmes Bakehouse, turnover around $3 million a year. Found that no one's buying their products. They're really struggling to sell their baked goods through their usual distribution channels. And the owner was looking at potentially having to sack all of his staff. And as a business owner, that's the worst feeling if you're ever faced with those kind of dilemmas. And within 72 hours, he reimagined his whole business proposition, created an e-commerce website where people can actually buy DIY, make your own baked goods at home kits. So you can bake focaccias, pizza dough, bread, cakes, whatever you want. And he created his e-commerce platform within 3 days, saving a bunch of jobs in the process. Again, it hasn't taken a huge amount of effort to do that. It's just reimagining things, and I think there's nothing worse than being put in a tricky situation to force people to make decisions. So that's a really nice example of an innovation that we've seen in the kind of the home category. As we know, 33% of businesses are looking for new innovations to create new revenue. That's another example of a company that's solved a problem that exists. With retail, as I mentioned up top, we are seeing in terms of people's future intentions is relatively muted. The opportunity for retailers at the moment, I think, is more in anything you've got that relates to kind of, at the moment, anything relates to lifestyle, hobbies, interests will perform, are going to perform quite well. Specialist retailers we've seen are also performing quite well compared to more traditional retailers who haven't been able to, might be, stocked up to the nines with last season's stock that they need to get rid of, are struggling a little bit to encourage people. And there's no indication at the moment that people are really thriving to go out there and buy next season's looks at the moment. And globally, we're going to see the retail sales fall by about 10% this year. So it's a huge loss globally. And then for a lot of retailers, drapers are estimating that they're going to have to cut their cost by 30%. So it's a sector that I think is going to be forced into making some pretty difficult decisions after the pandemic to really cope with the demand. But there's certainly at the moment, and I'll be very careful to label that, no indication that people are looking to jump out and go spend at this particular moment. We're seeing that they're more likely to be inclined, or it certainly ranks the highest in terms of people's intention to purchase items that relate to their hobbies and interests. And this is amongst people who frequently buy in retail. So these are the kind of avid retailers. They're more likely to be investing in things that relate to their personal interests at the moment than they are necessarily to do with apparel. Beauty's an interesting one. Currently, this week, people are claiming they're investing less in this sector. So when we ask people who frequently are engaged with it, then there's been less an indication that they are spending in products at the moment, but they are looking for advice. They're going to YouTube to get the look. They are looking for inspiration from beauticians online. And if you look at how those habits are changing week on week, you can kind of see some interesting variations with where people are sourcing their information. So that's quite an interesting category. Looking at people's future intention, I think we'll start to see some changes next week. If I was a betting person, I'd certainly put $5 on it. I think we will see some movements when we know about the announcements in the coming weeks. With exercise, as I mentioned, there's a question of why would you run when you can walk? And that's what we've seen is people who were enthusiastic about exercise in the last couple of weeks are now a little bit less likely to be doing more kind of rigorous forms of exercise. Any exercise that is happening is predominantly happening at home, or it's happening in form of walks as well. And women are more likely to be doing exercise each day compared to men. So they're being more proactive in that particular category. When we look at alcohol, as I mentioned before, some of the concerns are that this has turned into a bit of a coping mechanism for a lot of people, particularly amongst those who are concerned about their job security are more likely to be drinking frequently with others at home this week. So we do see a peak amongst those that are feeling quite anxious. So if as a human being, if you know anyone who is going through that, I think, being able to kind of offer conversation and some form of counsel, I think would sort of benefit people, because the potential sort of health risks with this, to be perfectly honest, do need to be called out. For those working in this particular sector, what we have seen is that for new products, we're seeing that the biggest opportunity is actually with people living in urban environments, and Gen Z and millennials are more likely to be open-minded to new products, as are key workers as well. So there's some interesting opportunities if you're looking to spark new innovations over this period. So that sort of summarizes it. I think for in terms of what we're seeing this week, it's quite interesting. There is a sense of a bit of a change. We know people are more geared to be looking forward to their family, connecting with other people, to be able to see, taste, experience things more so than anything. We've seen that in terms of our sense of community, that we whilst there are rumours about the change in lockdown and other countries are becoming are changing their restrictions, then people are feeling a change in their sense of community with their families, but also the flip of that is to others around the world as well. So there's going to be a bit of a change in mindset over the next few weeks with this. In terms of the categories, we are seeing more of an engagement at the moment, or a change in engagement with travel and entertainment. So certainly speaking to businesses at the moment, there's a lot of questioning on, who are the right demographics, who should we be talking to, when is the right time to communicate. These are all questions that we're now starting to address for people on a weekly basis. So there's certainly some movement there. Retail, I think, will continue. At the moment, looks like it's going to continue to struggle for the foreseeable future. But of course, when we obviously don't know what the restrictions are going to be, how things are going to change, we have no idea. As today, Thursday, the 7th of May, that picture is going to look differently by the end of the week. So, of course, it's really important to start to monitor and track these things on an ongoing basis. So this is a format in which you can do that. So I welcome you all to join us next week, next Thursday at 11 a.m, same time next week, where we will be delivering this webinar again. In terms of how you can get involved, we have our consumer tracker reports are available on our website if you want to download for free. We also have we've got the data tables if you want to download those. And if you're interested in more qualitative views of things, we have our diary studies, which you can look at as well. So that's all there for you to look at. Coming from us in the next month, we are launching our own automated research product called Rare Metrics. It comes out in June. We are looking for people to be the first cohort of people to use the service. At the end of the webinar, when I wrap up, you'll be asked to complete a questionnaire. Tell me what you thought. If you thought it was great, brilliant. If you didn't like it, great. Tell me. That's wonderful. It's good to know. Also, we've got a couple of questions there in terms of what we can improve, which is great to hear from the community about that. But also, if you are interested in being one of the first to trial the platform when it goes live, we are looking for our first cohort of users to try it out. The product itself, when it launches, will be focusing on advertising testing. So if you're testing comms, this is the kind of platform you can do that with. So any kind of questions on that, then please let me know, and we are looking for people to take part. And I'm going to open up. If you've got any questions, I'm going to open up for any Q&A. So one here just about, which I referred to earlier, is there any insight into who's enjoying lockdown and not wanting it to end? Well, it's something that we can look at in quite a bit of detail. I think it's one we're seeing there's quite a high, it's shifting quite a bit week on week. So we're seeing this kind of movement to people who feel, a bit more content. And just looking at the data yesterday, I remember the sort of comments that were demographically speaking, it's tough to answer that question. I'm not seeing any pattern there to decipher whether it's any particular demographic that actually doesn't want these restrictions, what wants to actually sort of this to continue as long as possible. I think it's going to probably be more about risk profile, and probably more about sort of those sort of concerns that will dictate whether how people feel with that particular question. So if it's something I want to have a look at, yeah, we can obviously pull that out. That's no problem. Any insight into how digital-only retailers such as Amazon are doing in the crisis? Yes. It's a shame we weren't here last week. We covered Amazon last week. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a kind of paradox with it, which I've found really fascinating in tech. I'll try and summarize this as quickly as I can, which is that for more kind of Amazon, Facebook, and Instagram are actually businesses that perform reasonably quite well in terms of the public perception that they have given a good response to the pandemic, which was sort of surprising, because you'd imagine that actually you'd see some sort of depletion with all the concerns with, safety for their staff and things like that. It's not what we've seen. And for Facebook, it's a bit like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, just didn't even take part. It didn't even happen. Particularly last week or week before, there was the settlement in the US court of $5 billion for their involvement with, concerns over, I think it was to do with the political issues there with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So it's almost as if nothing happened. Compare that, though, to those tech companies that are from Asian countries, completely different story. So actually we're seeing week on week, the perception has been quite poor. I haven't actually checked this week for that particular sector, but I can certainly, if you're interested, I can share. We have the data available if you'd like to see that. Are your previous webinars available online? Yeah, the first two we've done they're recorded online. And I know people are watching them. Someone actually sent me a screenshot of my face presenting on a webinar at 1 in the morning a couple of days ago. So I know people are watching it. It's a bit kind of concerning. The last 2 weeks, we need to upload them. So we're so busy with these webinars. We're actually having to run them twice a week now on a Thursday, just due to the demand. So we'll certainly get the next two up. Any concrete into how the pharmaceutical sector is performing at the moment? We work quite a bit in pharma, so I have some more anecdotal evidence from our clients at Rare. So I've got quite a bit of evidence there. If you've got a question, probably best if I address that after the webinar, because it sort of depends. Obviously, pharma's quite a big sector, so it depends which bit you're looking at. But I've been talking to 3 or 4 different pharma companies in the last couple of days who are clients, so I can certainly help with that. Are the slides available from previous weeks? Yeah, they're on SlideShare. So after this, I will be emailing you around copies of the slides from this week and an invite to next week. So please come next week at 11 o'clock on Thursday. Free to join. I'll try and do my best with my bad jokes. I really have to restrain myself. Quite a bit, actually. So yeah, on our SlideShare account, when I send you the link, you'll be able to see the previous slides as well. Any data points you're interested in, just give me a shout. This is our way of contributing at this point. This is our way at Rare for us to sort of help the community. So please, please do give me a shout. Any insight into soft drinks? Are there any insights in soft drinks, maybe water/sports drinks with people taking up exercise? Good question. We can do that if you're interested. So we could potentially look at including that in our weekly tracker. So any kind of feedback on this would be great. We are keeping it quite dynamic for people. So if you've got anything specific, then please do let me know, and we can look into that. There's one question someone's very kindly put here. It's quite long. If you don't mind, I'll address that one via email if that's all right, or maybe a phone call. It's about 3 paragraphs, so I'll deal with that one afterwards. And that's enough waffle from me. I'm sure you've had enough of my nasally Midlands accent. So yeah, please fill out the question at the end. That'd be wonderful. And if you are interested in taking part in the next webinar, please come down next week. If you've got any questions, then this is my email address if you've got any questions, but I will be following up with the slides, an invite into next week. And if you're interested in our Rare Metrics platform where you can do polling, ad testing, things like that. Please let us know. We're looking for a first cohort of users to give it a go and feedback. And that's all from me. Have a wonderful long weekend. I think we all need it, don't we? Great. See you all soon.